Hi, I'm Rod from Voices of North Sydney, and this video is about dispelling some myths and misconceptions about the way voting works, to look briefly at preferential voting and how that works, and then a slightly more detailed look at how preferences might flow when there's 10 candidates, as is the case in North Sydney. So first of all, myth number one, that parties do preference deals. Look, this makes great press. It's a lot of controversy going on, who's doing what deal with whom, but the reality is, yes, in fact, parties do preference deals, but it's true, but irrelevant, because only your vote counts. Parties have no control over preference flows after you've voted, and it's really just about their how to vote cards and how they would prefer you to vote. So the fact is that parties have no control over preference flows, you do. Myth or misconception 2. You have to follow a how to vote card to make a valid vote. This is absolutely false. The only requirement is to fill in all the boxes. In North Sydney, that will be from 1 to 10, and the order does matter, as you might see. So the fact is, there's no need to follow a how to vote card to make a valid vote. Myth or misconception 3. Preferences after 2 or 3 don't matter. The order of preferences really counts right through to the last count, depending on who you've put first and so forth. The thing that matters most is the order of preferences of one candidate over another, and this takes a lot of thought. The fact is, your preferences can have an effect right down to the end. Your ballot paper could be transferred at full strength, if you like, till there are just 2 candidates left. And if that sounds complicated and hard to know who to vote for in terms of how their values align with your thinking and values, that's why we've actually produced this Represent Me quiz, which gives you an indication of how well the different candidates align with your values and priorities. Myth and misconception 4. Voting one for a minor party or candidate is a wasted vote. This is also false. Voting one for a minor party or individual candidate whose policies you support is not a wasted vote. In fact, it's impossible to waste a vote unless you cast an informal vote. The fact is that when candidates with the lowest votes are progressively eliminated, your ballot gets transferred to your next preferred candidate. So it's not possible to waste a vote. Myth or misconception 5. Putting someone 2 instead of 1 is an effective protest. It's partly true, but ineffective. It might show up as a drop in the primary vote, and while it might concern the candidate, that is largely symbolic. Just as politicians like to say, the only poll that matters is the election, so take them at their word. Really, if you want to make a protest vote, the best way to do that is to make sure they don't get into power by putting them last. So let's move on to preferential voting. Not the most exciting topic on earth, which might explain why people use animals, marbles, cakes to make it interesting. We thought we might just keep it simple and use ballot papers. So here we have an election where there's 4 colours and there's 20 voters. And what happens here is that the voters vote for their favourite colour. So down the bottom they voted for lime green and then blue, and then you can see yellow. So there's the first preference votes for the 4 different colours and 20 electors in this case. And you can see the first preference votes there: pink, yellow, blue and green. Now what happens in a first past the post competition, which we don't have, would be that the candidate with the most votes would be considered to be the winner out of this 4-way competition. The problem with that, of course, is that that would have 7 voters who'd be happy with that result, but there'd be actually 13 voters not so happy. And preferential voting really aims to select the candidate that's most reasonably acceptable to most people. So just let's look at this in a bit more detail now, because what happens is that the candidate with the lowest count is effectively eliminated, but the ballots are actually transferred with full value. So you can see here the second preference was blue, and so that ballot paper is now transferred to the blue pile. This second preference was yellow, and so it's transferred to the yellow. And so you can see here now the lowest vote is going to be blue, so the next round we'll be transferring those votes from the blue pile, if you like, to somewhere else, as indicated on their ballot papers. So how does that work? Well, you can see here that on this, over on the right hand side, this ballot, which has said that they prefer pink to yellow, as I just said, you can see it's pink in comparison to yellow. So even though it's their third and fourth preferences, that has actually now landed on the pink pile. Here you can see 1, 2, because blue and green, as we've just said, have been wiped out. So now the third, it says third preference, but in fact that's now gone to the yellow pile. Whereas this, which was the second preference from the original people who voted for blue, and likewise here, there's another one. And then this one said second preference was pink. And lastly, we have this one going into the yellow pile. And you can see what's happened here, that where we had the original primary votes of 7 and 6, 7 for pink and 6 for yellow, we now have 9 for pink and 11 for yellow. So you can see that that's happened because even though there were 6 first preference votes for yellow, the addition of another 5 ballot papers that have been transferred from the blue and green have really tipped yellow over the line, as it were. And just to follow the trajectory of one ballot paper, down here this particular ballot paper was transferred from green to blue, which was their second preference, and then it was transferred to pink, which was their third preference. And as you can see, it just happens that that was still unsuccessful because ultimately pink was less than yellow. So when we get to North Sydney, it's a little bit more complicated. There's 10 candidates randomly ordered on the ballot paper by the Australian Electoral Commission. So let's just say that's the order that they appear on the ballot paper. But of course, when the counting starts, what happens is that they're going to be reordered. So it'll be reordered according to, let's say, the number of votes that they get in that first preference count. So you can see here that the lime green, which was number 3 on the ballot paper, has dropped down because of its lowest score to the bottom of the stack, if you like. So that's just to explain how this then flows through. We'll reorder it according to the number of votes. So I'd like to stress that this is hypothetical. The colours are not meant in any way to relate to any particular candidate or party. This is just to show how the preferences flow. But it does appear that there will be a 3-way contest at the end of the voting in North Sydney, which is quite an interesting situation. But we're not going to talk about that in this little explainer. So what happens here is that the first colour to be wiped out, in this case, is lime green, and their votes are then transferred according to the second preference on the ballot papers for the people who voted first for lime green to all of the other candidates. And you can see that diagrammatically here. And that really just continues through as each colour is sequentially taken out of the race, as it were, because of the number of votes they get. And so that continues right through, and there might be a bit of switching in terms of their counts, but just to keep it simple at the moment, I've just let them run straight through until you get to the situation here, which is not dissimilar to what we can probably expect to see in North Sydney, with 3 quite strong candidates. And as I say, that's really almost an unprecedented situation in Australian political history, and voting history at least. Now what happens here, of course, is that it's going to be down to 2, and you can see that on this diagram the ochre was slightly fewer votes than the grey, and the ochre preferences, it might not be their second and third preferences, it could be their 8th, 9th, 10th, as I've just shown with the little ballot cards, but they've all ended up on the ochre pile, and they've indicated that they either prefer purple to grey or grey to purple, and that will then determine where their ballot papers, which pile their ballot papers end up on, either the purple or the grey. And you can see here what's happened is in fact the combination of the preferences from ochre to the final pile of grey under column 8 there, the 8th elimination, is enough to bolster up the grey vote so that it just gets over the line compared to purple. So you can see here how it really does make a difference right up until that last count, how your preferences are actually distributed. And you can also see that back on column 1, over on the left, that in fact grey may have even had fewer votes originally than ochre. So things can flip around according to those preference flows. So what are the main messages I'd like to leave you with? Well, every vote counts, and there's no such thing as a wasted vote. Secondly, the order may count right through to 9 and 10, depending on which candidates get knocked out. So your vote, your ballot paper will always be there in that final 2 candidate contest. You do not have to follow how to vote cards. That's what the parties want you to think. It's the way they think you should vote. But actually, as I said, that's why we've produced our Represent Me quiz to help you see what the various values and priorities of the different candidates are, to help you work out how you want to vote. So really, this whole idea of preference deals are a distraction. It's really so that people don't have to take the trouble to think about how they really want to vote in a detailed way. And that's what we're really aiming to do, is to help you with those quite difficult decisions. And lastly, if you really want to register a protest, then put whoever it is that you don't want in power last.